Carrie Hane helps organizations increase income and decrease costs by rethinking how they create, manage, and collect their content, or connect with their content, rather. Through coaching and consulting, she helps them get the right information to the right people at the right time while improving processes. For more than 15 years as both a consultant and in-house employee, Carrie has been untangling information to make it ready for whatever the future holds. So, Carrie, without further ado, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nikki. Yep, this is on, right? Okay. Wow, everybody from the front left, and we're only in the back. Feel free to move up if you want to. I don't mind if you're moving during the talk. But I can see in the back. I can only not see close up. So thank you, Nikki. And yeah, come on up. Come on up. There's no water tricks or anything like that. There's no splash zone. All right. All right, well, I'm excited to be here. This is actually my first World IA Day, which is kind of amazing because I've been part of this community, the IA community, for a while, but it never worked out to be able to come here on a Saturday. Now I kind of have to because I'm speaking. So, you know, it is 2017, and the World Wide Web is now 28 years old. And we've gone from having a few hundred websites delivered over a network of phone lines at a relatively slow speed to having content everywhere, from your computer to your phone, your watch, your car, your TV, and even your refrigerator now. It keeps showing up in more and more places that we never expected or only dreamed of. Yet we're still designing in a literal box, the computer screen, based on what's been done in the past. So it's time that we had a different way of looking at content and creating it and structuring and designing it that's ready for anything that the future can hold. And to do that, we need to think outside of any interface so that we're ready for wherever our content needs to go next or however it needs to be organized next. So this is me. Nikki introduced me. I have been doing this stuff for about 17 years. Learning, I had the advantage of getting in on the ground floor and learning as I went, figuring stuff out when it was all new. But a couple years ago, I had the opportunity to work with some really amazing IAs while I was the content strategist for the IA Summit. And before then, my main focus had been on content management system implementation and implementing content strategy. And it still is, really. But during that experience, I learned about domain modeling and semantic relationships from those people. So after the summit, Mike Atherton, who had been one of the co-chairs and is actually organizing the World IA Day London today, where they're almost done, he and I teamed up to share a process that we used for creating the 2015 IA Summit website. And by putting his domain and content modeling experience together with my CMS implementation experience, we started what we called designing future-friendly content. And it's a 5-step process, and you can read about that on the web or ask me about that later. But today I'm going to focus on the first part, the domain modeling, and what it can do for small and mid-sized organizations who are struggling with their websites and digital strategies. This is something, the BBC does this. This is where Mike was, and this is where it comes up. And there's still a lot of people doing it at BBC and talking about it. But large organizations kind of are doing it, but the smaller ones are not. And I think there's some big opportunities there. So in our time together today, we're going to go on a journey to discover a new way of thinking about content. And we'll take a look at where we are, where we want to go, and how we're going to get there. Then we'll take a look at a few ways the future can be different if we only start thinking with IA and content rather than design. And after that, I want to hear from you. I want to have a discussion. I've left time more than just a few minutes at the end for question and answers so that we can really discuss how you might put this to practice, what you're already doing with it, so that we can learn from each other. I'm finding that this is a fairly new way of thinking about things, and people tend to start having lots of ideas and be able to share. So where are we? We've got a few problems as we start the third decade of the World Wide Web. There's so much content. There are over 1 billion websites, and every day over 2 million blog posts are published. But then again, content is the point, right? How do we make sure that we're creating something of value? We have so many devices and screen sizes. So when we create a website or a product, we have no idea where a visitor will be, what they'll use to view it, what browser they're using, or even what their connection speed is. So how do we design for this infinite combination of sizes and uses? Meanwhile, as we try to figure all that out, design trends keep changing. So what if we could do real renovations to design without having to change all the underlying structure and content every time we did that? And despite lip service, organizations are still designing content for themselves, not their users. So how do we change that? And silos are strong. People are doing different things with different priorities, and that includes stakeholders and possibly your team too, if it's big enough. So what if there were a way to get everyone to focus on the same things and have the same priorities? These problems are not solved with a tool or a technology or a website. I was just talking to someone at the break about that, who's not even in this sphere, this industry. She's in a completely different industry, and it's the same thing. Websites are too downstream. The fact that we have to keep redesigning them every few years, literally tearing them down and rebuilding them, proves that websites are a symptom of a bigger problem. We collectively are not asking good questions. We're not looking at the people and processes that are behind the websites. In essence, we're solving bad problems with websites and with the other systems and tools that are being put in place. So in essence, we're kind of like WALL-E and repackaging garbage. And of course, I do not mean to say that everything we do is garbage. There is a lot of good work happening, but you wouldn't be here today if everything was perfect at your organization, with your clients, or with the World Wide Web in general. So we're starting to get an idea of what the future looks like, and it's the Internet of Things. And not just in the first world where we control our houses from our phones or make our lights tweet, but solving real problems in African villages, in Indian cities. Everything has the potential to be connected. But this network isn't going to work if we keep doing things the same way we've always done them. And really, that's only been the last 20 years, so it shouldn't be so hard to change. Yet, I think we all know that change is hard no matter how long something has been done. So I'm not going to talk about anything about artificial intelligence. John is going to talk about that later. So go to his talk and learn about that from him, because I know nothing. But information architecture has a really important role in this future, as do content strategists and designers. So without a solid foundation and structure, the future is not going to be as wonderful as it could be. So how do we get there? Well, we start by asking better questions. We slow down and take a step back. And we think differently about how we create, connect, and manage our content. If we keep solving bad problems, that future is not going to happen. We need to shape the structures of the interwebs, and we need to lead and not follow. So information architects and content strategists are perfectly positioned to lead this charge. We're the ones who relish organizing things, making sense of messes, and untangling information. And there is a lot of mess out there on the information superhighway for us to pick up. And we don't need to wait around for someone else to do it. We shouldn't get to the end of our careers and think, why aren't we living on the moon? Of course, we're not solving that problem. Elon Musk is working on that for us. This is one of my favorite comic strips, Sally Forth. And Sally and Ted are children of the 80s, like I am, and many of you probably are. there's a constant thread of where are the jetpacks that I was promised when I was a kid, and the Jetsons and all of that stuff that we saw when we were younger. They should be here by now. And this one was just on New Year's Eve day this year. Like, you know, in 2 years, we'll be living on a colony of moon, so we don't need to worry about the next presidential election. That's what he's saying. So it's this idea of not just waiting for it to happen, but being part of the future and shaping it. So one of the ways we can do that with information architecture is looking at domain models. Domain models take us to that 30,000-foot view to see what's in our universe. As the name suggests, it's the model of the subject domain, how all the principal concepts are related. And this is where we need to start design from, so we're not limiting it by the technical constraints of the website or even by the content that we have. Instead, when we do a domain model, we're focused only on our best representation of the subject itself. We're not worried about the level of complexity this exposes at this point, because we're modeling truth, not websites. We don't need to be afraid of that complexity, as Abby was saying earlier. So domain models are made up of two parts, concepts and relationships. The concepts are the things that exist within a subject. If we're talking about space travel, we might start talking about spacecraft and launches and missions and astronauts and planets and moons. And the concept of mission has a different meaning in space travel than it does in business or in marketing. So we tend to define the concepts within the realm of a subject domain so we're clear on what we're talking about. And these concepts are meant to be reusable. So you might think of them as the category of a thing rather than the thing itself. So if we're talking about a concept of planets, Jupiter and Mars would be two examples of that concept. And then, of course, they break down further into properties which make up that concept. And those concepts are connected by relationships. So, and we have to keep in mind here that we're thinking about the real world relationships, not website navigation or anything else like that at this point. Not only can we connect them, but we can also describe how two things are related, which gives an extra dimension to understanding the subject domain. And if expressed through an interface, gives an educational aspect of describing how the world joins up. So let's take a look at that with a few examples here. So if we have a concept of a moon and a planet, we can say that the moon orbits the planet. Anyone want to tell us how an author is related to a book? Yes. An ingredient is part of a recipe. Now this one's a little trickier. A movie is an adaptation. Woo! All right, Anne. You're the first person who said that exact word. So you get this idea. And these obviously there's no right answer. It's your best representation of your world at that time. So here's an example of a domain model, and this is an example for a conference. Any conference, we have these things. There's a conference brand. There's events that are part of that conference. There's venues and locations and roles and people, and sometimes there's hotels, and always there's sponsors and topics and sessions and all of these things. They exist whatever conference you're talking about for the most part. And then they have relationships. You know, an event is part of a conference brand. A person is involved in an event. An event is hosted at a venue, and on and on. So there's multiple relationships between things, and they can go both ways. You can see how this changes how you're looking at something versus let's think of a website menu. And what do we need to include in that? This takes everyone back up and focuses them. You might be thinking, isn't this a content model? I hope nobody's thinking that, because it's not. A domain model is everything about the subject matter. It provides context. And once that is set, then we can zoom in and create the content model, which is the expression, which adds specific detail about the content, which will express and describe the domain. So we're moving from the abstract toward the specific. And the content model describes the content we'll actually show to users. While we typically audit our content based on subjective decisions about how well it's done, how many page visits it gets, or any number of other criteria, when we have a domain model, we can audit our content inventory against that. And this helps us create that content that's valuable instead of just whatever we can think of at the moment. So from the domain model, the content model is the next step in narrowing down the universe we have defined in the domain model. We can now make decisions about concepts and relationships and which ones we're going to expose in various interfaces. Where domain models are concerned with meaning and concepts, content models provide the structure and properties for those concepts. So here's an example of the content model for the IA Summit. And this is, you're going to see this over and over because this is obviously what this talk is based on, that experience. And these are the examples we have readily available. So we determined the content types based on the domain model and assigned properties. And then the content types themselves can have relationships much like the domain model, only here we're using cardinality of one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many, and that's how we're connecting things up. So you might notice that here in our content model, we have 6 content types, whereas in the domain model, we had 12 concepts. So what happened, you probably can't see from back there, but there's a few things in green. In the venue, there's a geolocation, and in the session, there's session type and topic. As those 3 things were concepts in the domain model, and they turned out to be properties of other things. We also eliminated brand because that's what we're modeling here. We're modeling the IA Summit brand. And we also lost hotel because that turned out to be an example of a venue. And location, which is the 6th one that doesn't show up here, turns out to be a property of several content types and not a concept in itself. So here's a zoom in on the person content type. And you can see that we defined properties about a person. And note that this is a person and not a speaker. And that's because from year to year, an individual might have different roles. One year they might be a speaker, another year a keynote speaker, another year a co-chair. So no matter what role they have, we want to know the same information about them. So instead of different content types for speakers and volunteers, we created a role taxonomy to relate people to events. So before starting all the usual things like doing a content model or creating a taxonomy or doing a sitemap, we're going to be much better off if we start with a domain model. I'm not going to say you need to. Obviously, we've been doing this for a long time without doing it. But if you can start with a domain model, you're going to have a whole new experience because it sets parameters and constraints that are needed for the life of your product or your website. So what does this get us in reality? Well, it makes decisions more deliberate about what to include and what to exclude. So how often do you hear something like, set up a website and a blog, whether it's for a startup or a new campaign or that needs a microsite or a new business or any number of reasons that someone thinks another website and blog need to exist. When you have the domain model, you've already determined what the real world looks like. And now you can make a direct connection between the real world and what can support a need or help someone take action. So even though we use technology to get things done, the need to do something starts offline. And domain models help make the connection between the human need and the computer that allows the task to be accomplished. Maybe having 200 sites sounds familiar to you. This is actually a quote from a conversation I had with someone at a university. I've had other conversations where I hear where at least one government agency has 900 websites. And this happens, whatever scale we're talking about, it happens because no one took the time to figure out why they all needed to exist in the first place. So again, with that domain model in hand, you start to see the relationships and the potential for duplication if you're not careful and you just start creating things all over the place. I cannot imagine a case where any one organization needs 200 websites, no matter how big they are. If we're to continue to make the web useful, we need fewer websites with fewer pages. And each website, product, or page needs to have purpose, and it needs to fit together with other sites and products and pages like a puzzle, not a scattering of pickup sticks that we use to keep our kids busy because we got to make dinner. So you might be thinking, well, that creates a lot of limitations for us. On the contrary, a domain model creates expansiveness, not limitations. It sets boundaries and creates connections. It can be a catalyst to do a lot of things, so it does need context. So let's talk about another context you might be familiar with. Say you're a historical attraction, and you have land on which sit the owner's original house and other buildings. There's also a farm and a garden and a museum and a library and a gift shop. And those are all things that exist, and they exist in lots of different iterations. The historical attraction I'm thinking of may not be the same one as you, but those things all exist within it. There's also stories about that historical figure who lived there and his family, and there's stories about how the grounds have been maintained, how they were originally used and how they've been maintained over the last 200 years. And there's products for sale and exhibits for people to visit and documents and photos that are used for research and publications. So we could create a domain model around these things and how they connect. And we can then see where the boundaries are and where there are opportunities to support user journeys. And so these set the stage for connecting content deliberately rather than haphazardly. Instead of a "you might also like" list of somewhat related things on a web page about a popular exhibit display item, you could see that this exhibit is related to items in the library or in the gift shop. It might also have been part of a well-known story which could be told on a blog for students. I mean, these are all just completely random examples that I wrote when I was writing this. If we were more deliberate, we would have much more functional things. But the idea is that it opens a door to a different way of exploring your subject area and things within it. So you might be thinking, that all sounds nice, but how am I going to do this? I'm not in charge of our domain. The better question might be, how much will people allow you into their space? So I'm going to go through a couple ways that might be possible in your organization or within your client projects, but also keep Abby's advice earlier in mind. I have been through all of that before, and yeah, start small and figure out where you can fit it in. So domain modeling is part of research. If you're doing research, you should be able to do a domain model, because design starts with a common language. And the information we gather from interviews can be used to identify the concepts and relationships and rules of a subject domain. So here's an example of an interview transcript. We can extract from it the users or experts' view of the world. Reading into it, reading to find the nouns and ask questions which define each thing and how it's different for another thing. Like here we have lightning talks and speakers and keynotes and folks who give full day and half day workshops. Okay, are speakers and keynotes and folks, are those all the same kind of thing? Are they different? Is a keynote different to a speaker? And then we have half day and full day workshops. Do all sessions have a variable duration? We start finding things like that. There's sessions and social events and venues and sponsors, and all of these things come out from actual reading a transcript. And then we have verbs, and those tell us how the nouns relate to each other and how they're connected. So you can do this with experts who map your world and with users who mark the points of interest. You could also do domain modeling as a pre-card sort activity. as a way of figuring out what to put on the cards that you're going to sort. So based on interviews, we can extract and define concepts that will form our domain model. These are the concepts we defined for the IA Summit, which you saw earlier in the domain model. From here, we can figure out what things we want to include in the card sort. Now, you're probably not going to put brand and event and location and sponsor on cards to sort, but those, from there, you can start to extract the things that you do want to sort and how that would work for you. Again, rather than starting from what you've got or what someone else kind of randomly thinks of at the time. You can also create a domain model as a pre-kickoff meeting activity before even starting to build a website or an app or a product or a database. Determine that it needs to happen or set the parameters for it. This idea goes back to that we need a website and blog without thinking about what problems those things solve and what needs to be included in them. Most of all, you need to lead and not dictate. Instead of marching into a meeting or a colleague's office telling them about the great domain model you're going to create or have already created, share that you want to maybe map communication efforts. And so then this starts showing duplication of efforts across your silos, and it starts to build connections with your peers because you're not encroaching on their area of specialty. You're helping them to do their jobs more effectively and efficiently. And who doesn't want that, right? Less work, better outcomes. Ta-da, magic. So domain models need context, and they can be a catalyst for your content and for solving some organizational issues themselves that you probably deal with a lot. So as I said, content duplication is a plague running through our digital world. We think more about resources and we need to think more about resources and canonical references and fewer single-purpose pages. So let me show you an example of what I mean. People. We often think of just the information in a specific context and what that needs to look like. So we're going, this is an inside-out perspective. And this should not be moving automatically. But if we start from thinking about the real world and a person, I don't know, I should just stop trying to do builds in my things because they never work. We start to think about how the things we are describing connect to other things we're describing. So over the last 18 years, there have been thousands of people involved in the IA Summit. Now we're just starting over. Whether as there's attendees and volunteers and speakers. And for any given year, those people get involved in a certain way or choose not to participate. And each year they might have different roles, such as a volunteer. Therefore, year over year, they need to be represented differently depending on whether they're a speaker or a co-chair or a peer reviewer. But the data about that person doesn't change. They have the same attributes, even outside of the IA Summit. So our domain model works from the outside in, which allows us to do resource-driven design, as Michael Smethurst suggests in a recent blog post, and these slides are online on my SlideShare, so you can get it, and there's probably ways that the World IA Day will connect. But there's a link down here to that blog post, which is fabulous and covers a lot more than this. So this was the model we used for creating the 2015 IA Summit website. Our goal was to create a website not for 2015, but that could be reused year over year. And here we go again. So instead of a separate website for each event, we'd build one based on resources that could be reused, restyled, and remixed year after year. So the current year's event would be the context for the interface, but whether we linked from the 2015 list of speakers or the 2016 list of volunteers, or the 2017 session speakers, we'd link back to the same resource. One place to enter it, one URL, one set of information, not 3 different ones because they happen to be involved 3 different years. We talk a lot about curation, and curate means to pull together, sift through, and select for presentation. We're doing this all the time on the web, but we did this long before there was a web. Museums curate, libraries curate, art galleries curate, interior designers curate. If we were to curate an exhibit of Monet's paintings this year, and then next year we wanted to do one for French Impressionists, we would use a subset of the same Monet paintings. And we might borrow some paintings for that French Impressionist exhibit from another museum to make it extra special or to give it different context. But what we wouldn't do is recreate the paintings because it was a different context. Not least because Monet is not alive anymore to do that, but we still wouldn't. We wouldn't ask him to recreate it even if he were alive. Yet this happens on the web over and over. We recreate things for different interfaces. Heck, we re-architect, redesign, and rewrite entire massive websites every few years. Now, we are getting better at reusing content, and retailers and media companies are leading the way because they kind of have to. But smaller organizations aren't doing this so much. When you take that outside-in point of view and think about what concepts are in your world and how to connect them and how you want to represent them, you get a much more sustainable and rich interface. And also because you're designing from the outside in, you gain flexibility within any given interface or across interfaces which may or may not be your own. And then you also get that flexibility across the different devices and the different screen size. So the domain model is just the start of a foundation for a system based on resources, not pages. It leads to content models and design frameworks that allow us to be platform neutral. And we have to remember that it's not just websites anymore. So the domain model also helps your organization beyond having better content. It helps a little bit. It can, I say, it, not necessarily so, but it can help with the politics within your organization itself. Because you're elevating the conversation to be about what your stakeholders care about most, their area of expertise, you're more likely to avoid the arguments about what goes on the homepage. Getting everyone together to talk about how real-world concepts relate to one another, you're more likely to get people to align faster than if you tried to get them to agree on a sitemap based on a content audit they didn't agree with in the first place, because if only their bit of content were on the homepage, they would have had more page views, right? You're laughing like this has happened before. I thought I was the only one. So with that alignment, you can start to reprioritize. Within every discipline or company, there are some basic facts or principles that need to be followed. If you're a professional society focused on furthering that profession, it's harder for people to disagree about things about being a practitioner in that field are most important than it is about what goes at the top of the homepage. If you can base your website's prioritization, whether in the actual interface or in user stories or the projects that you're doing or the testing you're doing, if you can base those on real-world priorities, you're going to be much better off. So remember those 200 websites for one organization, or 900 or 10 or however many you have? Guess what? Having a domain model helps to corral those into a cohesive set rather than one-off microsites, because why not another one? We already have one, and that other department got one, so why can't I have one? A domain model allows you to create a plan for aligning and connecting your different domains, which are really URLs, making them easier to manage and govern. So this idea may not be brand new to some of you, but maybe it's given you new context and provided some ideas for thinking of your offering as part of a wider conversation. As users ourselves, we use the whole web as our resource, cherry-picking information from wherever we can find it, and our audience is the same way. So when we're publishing, ask not just what is this doing for my customer, but what is this doing for the web as a whole? The only thing we can predict is, with any certainty, is that things will change. As more and more information is produced, it's essential to be findable and usable and to provide value. Thinking content first will pay off when the next disruption happens. So that's what I have to say here today. Now I want to open that up to become a facilitator of a discussion. Also, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I'm sure that some of you have had some experience with this or some ideas. So please, if someone has a question, if you have an answer, please feel free to step in and respond and participate in the discussion. And who wants to be brave and start? So, well, let me ask you this. How might this change your work as you're sitting there? Do you have ideas of how you might be able to go back to the office on Monday or next month and start the wheels turning of doing something differently? No ideas whatsoever. Yeah.
Hi. I guess I'm a little bit, I'm just going to be honest, I'm a little intimidated by the thought, like, this is all great, and I, like, have no idea how to, like, implement this into, like, an already, like, churning train that's, like, way down the road, and you know what I mean? Like, how to do this in the middle of, like, things, I guess. Like, I guess maybe, like, suggestions from you or anyone else of, like, where to start when we're not really in, like, a starting place necessarily on our project.
Yeah, and the domain model isn't probably something you can insert in the middle unless you've gotten to a point where nobody can agree on something. You could take that step back and say, okay, we're having problems. Actually, all you need is a whiteboard or stickies and some Sharpies to create this. It doesn't have to take a long time. How you use it afterwards does, but actually sitting down to create this and getting everyone in the room to say, you know what, let's stop and say, okay, what are we trying to do here? What is in our world? And you can do that in a couple-hour workshop. So you could do it then if you're at a big sticking point. But yeah, if you're in the middle of a project, you're not going to stop and do this. A project that's humming along, you're not going to stop and do this. But you could keep it in mind. You could do it for yourself as a frame of reference, and then come back to that when you're done and say, okay, we've got this. Now let's make sure we govern it. It can be part of that cycle, and starting, doing it when you get to the point of governing, so that you make sure you keep that, keep it up, and don't start straying off into too many different directions. Does anybody else have other ideas for that?
This is not another idea, but aren't you just saying that you can use this as a principled way to decide this makes sense with what we're doing or not? And so actually it's a nice way to slowly pare off those weird things that people want. So, I mean, the really good ideas they had, yeah.
Yeah. and there are really good ideas, and that's something, and that's more of a process thing, but I had a client once it was a military organization, and their chief of staff was a retired, I don't know if he was a colonel or a general, but he said, in military planning, we get to a point where it's a good idea cutoff point. And ever since then, I use that in all my projects, because he said that at our kickoff meeting. He's like, we're going to get to a point where you guys can't have any more ideas. And he said to us as a consultants, you need to let us know when that is, because that wasn't there. But yeah, you get to that point and no more new ideas, and that domain model can be part of that. Like, the parking lot of, let's come back to that. Joe.
So I love this idea of what have you done for your customer. I'm sorry. I love this idea of what have you done for your customer and what have you done for the world. So it makes me think, yes, IA and content strategy and domain modeling for social good. So I wanted you to say a few more words about that, because I think we need all the inspiration we can get these days, and that would be fantastic.
Couldn't you have told me that beforehand? You were going to ask me that. Yeah, we get into our silos and our boxes, and we put our blinders on, and we think, okay, I got to do this, and this is what I'm doing, and this is what my boss told me to do, and this is what's going to get me recognition because I solved this problem. Well, someone else might have already solved it, and you didn't look for it. You made it all up yourself when someone else already did half of it, and you could have linked to them. So there's a saying, and I did not make this up, and I can't remember who did, but it's do what you do best and link to the rest. If there were more resource-based systems out there, we would do a better job of connecting. So you know, this is a thing that's happening. There's more APIs. There's more web services, and you have to have that, and that goes into the structured content. But you have to think about how your stuff is going to be used now by you, and how it could be used by someone else. Because you know, we're getting to a world where people start at Google, and if Google can't find your stuff, then it doesn't do any good. And I know Erin has a whole talk about that. That is wonderful too. We just have to remember that we are part of a bigger world, and that world really is the internet at this point, at least in our lives, and increasingly in everybody's life in the world. So we need to step out of our little box and think of the wider world. I don't know if that was very inspirational, but
yes.
Yeah.
Sort of coming off of that idea of doing more good in the world, and the idea that lots of small organizations have bad websites. I've been trying to figure out a way to volunteer my IA skills to these small nonprofits in DC, and cropping up all over the place right now. But I wonder if anybody has any ideas on how to pitch the idea of, like, I want to work on the information architecture of your website. Like, it just doesn't sound that exciting, I think, to people. Where, like, if you're a graphic designer, you can come in and say, oh, I'll make your website look beautiful. But, like, coming in and trying to tell people, I want to make your website work better, so that then people can Google them and find the information that these groups are trying to put out there.
Yeah.
So if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Do we have another mic? Because there's some people on this side, and I don't want to, like, take 30 seconds in between. So you, and then Anne.
Yeah. In response to that question, I would actually say pitch it more in the vein of, I see some ways to increase the engagement with your website. You've got some really great content here, but I see ways where you could get more involvement with your audience, as well as expand it out to a larger audience. And that way it comes off as maybe less critical and also less kind of techie.
Yeah, Anne, did you have a different idea? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to that point, the metaphor is basically, you know, you've got this Lotus sitting at the curb, right? It's a gorgeous $90,000 sports car that does not run. Doesn't matter how pretty it is, if it doesn't function, nobody's ever going to use it. And IA is basically what makes your site or your app or your product function. So if there's no there, it doesn't matter how pretty it is. So if you kind of pitch it that way, that's a way to kind of open their minds about it.
Yeah, over here.
Yeah, as someone that works at a nonprofit, you know, I can say that there's probably at least one person in that organization, if it's a middle-sized nonprofit or even a small organization, that is probably more digitally savvy and might be frustrated with the way things are going. And so finding that person and having a conversation with them about what their frustrations are, that could be a really good foot in the door.
Yeah, here.
I had a question actually. So it's like very relatable. I recently went through a phase. I work at an enterprise startup. But what the difference I'm trying to figure out is, in case of the startups or in the enterprise world, there are products. Products keep on evolving. So have you come across ways by which the domain model at least can work for a few years and doesn't have to revamp as new features come in?
Well, that's the whole point. You never should have to revamp the domain model unless you completely change your mission, because it's the real world. What is that world that product lives in? If it's, this has a lot of use in branding, what is the world that your product is in? And you might have a domain model that's huge, and you might only want to expose 2 or 3 of those concepts. But if you understand where you're fitting in, that leads to being more useful, because now you're like, okay, well, if I have a product that makes it, I don't know, I'm drawing a blank on.
What I'm trying to say is that we start with a set of objects, and one object has a single child object. And if we know for a future that object and the child object relation will just remain one-to-one.
Right.
All of a sudden it becomes one-to-many because of a new feature rollout.
So where does that fit in with the domain? Is that maybe another concept bringing in, and so there's related things that need to do it? I guess my point is, yeah, it may not be quite as applicable to products themselves, but you still have to know where you're fitting in to the bigger world, and that may be a very small subset of that world, but it's part of a bigger world. And to know that, and to have those boundaries of maybe that feature doesn't fit into this world and that belongs in some other, because we all know that feature creep and all of that stuff ruins products. So this can help you with those boundaries to say, okay, if this is true, what else is true? Can we fit some more concepts in here? And is that contributing to helping make more sense of this world? Does that help? Okay, in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to respond.
Okay.
As someone that actually worked on applications in startups, I've seen a lot of situations where you need to do some proper user research in order to understand your domain, and then you have to pick and choose exactly what you're implementing. But you need to design for the future as well. So you know when this feature comes, where are you going to put it? If you don't think ahead, you're not going to do that properly. And you have to scope out some of those features, because otherwise it's not going to be feasible to finish whatever you wanted to finish in the time that you have. And so it's really a matter of knowing your users and understanding what is the most important thing that they can get, but really understanding that in the future you might need to have a different relationship. You might need to have more parameters for your objects that you might need to include into your user experience, into your UI. I really believe that user research helps you to understand this domain and to scope it. So.
There was another, Erin.
So I had my hand up. It might be premature because I'm thinking through my question a little bit more, but could you elaborate a little bit on how taxonomies and the domain model and sitemaps kind of relate to one another? I'm having just to make sure I'm tracking what is the relationship between those sorts of organization systems?
So it's a kind of a waterfall. So the domain model is up here, and then we go into those other activities, always referring back. So it's kind of a point of reference. If you get to that sticking point and then say, oh, we made it a sitemap, or we are creating taxonomies. Oh wait, I'm not sure we're on. So you can kind of go back and go, okay, does that make sense with the relationships that are here? Like we saw one just super simple example is that role, which was a concept in our domain, but obviously didn't live by itself, and it became a taxonomy. So we were able to start out with, okay, these are the taxonomies we need. So it led to that. So it really is kind of the locus of that. It informs. Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts or ideas or questions? This has been really great. Yeah. Oh.
She's oohing for me. So, we were just having a side conversation. So I was asking Joe basically if I was understanding the concept correctly, where you have the content model of person, for example, and in the domain of conference, you had listed those specific attributes: name, what company, job title, etc. Is it that the content model is stable and only certain attributes are exposed depending on what the domain/context is, or do those attributes change depending on what the context is? And I'll give you the example that I was using with her. So in the context of conference, my job title, the company I work for, my Twitter handle, those are all relevant. But in the context of singles bar, what might be more relevant is redheads are really sexy, which is not so relevant when I'm at a conference. So am I kind of understanding that those attributes are stable but just not exposed, or do they change?
So the attributes are stable. Which of them? So yeah, we could have listed everything about a person, and in a different context, name, first name, last name, occupation, birth date, all kinds of other things could have been in place. The domain model is stable. The content model is interface specific. So that is going to change, and it's going to change as you go on. So this content model that I showed is only kind of step 2. When we got to the actual implementation of the website, which is part of the bigger talk and workshop, it changes. Yet still, when you're implementing it in the content management system or whatever system you're using to manage it for a product or an app, because you need some technical things, and you might need to things like, in this case, we have name, but in the CMS we had first name and last name, so that we could sort by last name and put things in different orders if we wanted to. But those are things we're not thinking of at this level. We're still real world, what is relevant in this context. So that's where that the content model starts to be very. You could have 3 different content models based on the same domain model, depending on what you wanted to expose. Yeah, a question over here.
So when you were going over this, I was trying to create my own version of a domain model based on what I was working on, and I realized it was laden with assumptions. So I guess when you do sort of those interviews and user research to extract concepts for the domain model, what are some of the questions that you're trying to get at or try to get answered, or how do you extract that?
Yeah, it's so when I have done, so I'm just going to say that in working with Mike, this is his stuff. So I've been learning from him and evolving my ideas from that. But when I think about if I had known this years ago, how it would have affected how I did my work. One of the ways is when you're interviewing, especially a subject matter expert, it's just understanding their world and asking questions like, if you don't understand a world, keep asking, what is that? I don't understand. Does that fit together with this? I don't think there's any specific, it's kind of all the same questions we ask, no matter if we're creating a domain model or not. It's just using that differently. And in the workshop that we do, we have an exercise where we're giving them an interview and we're saying, okay, here's an interview. What concepts are you getting out of that? So it's taking that transcript and using it differently. And maybe going back to say, oh, I'm looking at this in a different way. Did you mean this? And are these things the same? Are they related does this always happen, or is it sometimes? And so you start to get that. So it may be something you go back to clarify what you got, but it's just really using, it's not really different questions, it's just using the output in a different way. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sort of in a situation where my company, like, just through natural evolution, now kind of has two distinct product offerings with kind of two separate entities and their own domain models. Would you think that when those eventually merge together, would it be best to come up with a brand new domain model that includes both, or try to somehow merge them together into one of the existing models?
I'm going to give you the classic answer of that depends. Yeah, I don't, without knowing specifics, and we could talk later and talk through that idea, I would think that if one company has two businesses, they're somehow related. And so you have to figure out where that commonality is, and that's your domain model. So that maybe that helps, but I can't really say much more than that without. But I'm going to be here all day, so we can, you know, if someone wants to grab me and talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and that decision will come over my head anyway. I'm just sort of looking at, eventually it has to happen. My mind is sort of.
Right, yeah. Well, I think, like, you know, starting, you can have that idea, and then when people are talking about the new website or splitting domains or making a new microsite, you say, hey, what if we thought about this way? And you could sketch it out yourself and see if, does this make sense? And that might trigger something above that says, oh, you know, yeah, we do need to think of it like that. Yeah. All right, I think we're just about out of time too.
Yep.
All right, and I don't want to keep you from lunch. So like I said, I'm here all day. You can get in touch with me on my website at tanzenconsulting.com, on Twitter, or by email. And these are on SlideShare, on my SlideShare, Carrie Hane. So you can download it from there or look at it.
Yep, and everyone will have the link to your slide deck and all the videos shortly after the event.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you, Carrie.